So I will now be talking about the Reformation in England. However, before I get to that, I am not sure if you were able to hear the rain outside. If you can, I apologize for that, but I guess it is very fitting for the country that I will be discussing right now. Other than that, let's get straight to it. The English Reformation took place in 16th century England, when the Church of England broke away from the authority of the Pope and the Roman Catholic Church. Ideologically, the groundwork for the Reformation was laid by Renaissance humanists, who believed that the Scriptures were the only source of Christian faith, and criticized religious practices which they considered superstitious. By 1520, Martin Luther's new ideas were known and debated in England, but Protestants were a religious minority and heretics under the law. The English Reformation began as more of a political affair than a theological dispute. In 1527, Henry VIII requested an annulment of his marriage, but Pope Clement VII refused. In response, the Reformation Parliament passed laws abolishing papal authority in England and declared Henry to be the head of the Church of England. Final authority in doctrinal disputes now rested with the monarch. Though a religious traditionalist himself, Henry relied on Protestants to support and implement his religious agenda. The theology and liturgy of the Church of England became markedly Protestant during the reign of Henry's son, Edward VI, largely along lines laid down by Archbishop Thomas Cranmer. Under Mary I, Roman Catholicism was restored, and England was briefly under papal jurisdiction. The Elizabethan religious settlement reintroduced the Protestant religion, but in a more moderate manner. Nevertheless, disputes over the structure, theology, and worship of the Church of England continued for generations. The English Reformation is generally considered to have concluded during the reign of Elizabeth I, but scholars also speak of a long Reformation, stretching into the 17th and 18th centuries. This time period included the violent disputes over religious manifested in the English Civil Wars and the execution of Charles I. After the Stuart Restoration, the Church of England remained the established church, but a number of nonconformist churches now existed, whose members suffered various civil disabilities until these were removed many years later. A substantial but dwindling minority of people from the late 16th to early 19th century remained Roman Catholics in England. Their church remained illegal until the Relief Act of 1829. England began the 16th century as a Roman Catholic nation. Roman Catholicism taught that repentant people could cooperate with God towards their salvation by performing good works. God's grace was given through the 7 sacraments: baptism, confirmation, marriage, holy orders, anointing of the sick, penance, and the Eucharist. The Eucharist was celebrated during the Mass, the central act of Roman Catholic worship. In this service, a priest consecrated bread and wine to become the body and blood of Christ through transubstantiation. The Church taught that in the name of the congregation, the priest offered to God the same sacrifice of Christ on the cross that provided atonement for the sins of humanity. The Mass was also an offering of prayer by which the living could help souls in purgatory. While penance removed the guilt attached to sin, Roman Catholicism taught that a penalty still remained. It was believed that most people would end their lives with these penalties unsatisfied and would have to spend time in purgatory. Time in purgatory could be lessened through indulgences and prayers for the dead, which were made possible by the communion of the saints. Lollardy anticipated some Protestant teachings, derived from the printings of John Wycliffe, a 14th century theologian and Bible translator. Lollardy stressed the primacy of Scripture and emphasized preaching over the Eucharist, holding the latter to be but a memorial. Though persecuted and much reduced in numbers and influenced by the 15th century, Lollards were receptive to Protestant ideas. Renaissance humanists, such as Erasmus, John Colet, and Thomas More, called for a return back to the sources of Christian faith, the Scriptures as understood through textual and linguistic scholarship, and want to make the Bible available in the local language. Humanists criticized superstitious practices and clerical corruption, while emphasizing inward piety over religious ritual. Some of the early Protestant leaders went through a humanist phase before embracing the new movement. The Protestant Reformation was initiated by Martin Luther, and by the early 1520s his views were known and disputed in England. The main plank of Luther's theology was justification by faith alone, rather than by good works. In this view, God's unmerited favor is the only way for humans to be justified. It cannot be achieved or earned by righteous living. In other words, justification is a gift from God received through faith. If Luther was correct, then the Mass, the sacraments, charitable acts, prayer to saints, prayers for the dead, pilgrimage, and the veneration of relics do not mediate divine favor. To believe otherwise would be superstition at best and idolatry at worst. Early Protestants portrayed Roman Catholic practices such as confession to priests, clerical celibacy, and requirements to fast and keep vows as burdensome and spiritually oppressive. Not only did purgatory lack any biblical basis according to Protestants, but the clergy were also accused of leveraging the fear of purgatory to make money from prayers and masses. Roman Catholics countered that justification by faith alone was a license to sin. The publication of William Tyndale's English New Testament in 1526 helped to spread Protestant ideas. Printed abroad and smuggled into the country, the Tyndale Bible was the first English Bible to be mass-produced, and there were probably 16,000 copies in England by 1536. Tyndale's translation was highly influential, forming the basis of all later English translations. An attack on Roman Catholic teachings, Tyndale's translation included an epilogue explaining Luther's theology on justification by faith, and many translation choices were designed to undermine Roman Catholic teachings. Protestant ideas were popular among some parts of the English population, especially among academics and merchants with connections to continental Europe. Nevertheless, English Roman Catholicism was strong and popular in the early 1500s, and those who held Protestant sympathies remained a religious minority until political events intervened. As heretics in the eyes of church and state, early Protestants were persecuted. Henry VIII became King of England in 1509 at the age of 17. He made a dynastic marriage with Catherine of Aragon, widow of his brother Arthur, in June 1509, just before his coronation. Unlike his father, who was secretive and conservative, the young Henry appeared the epitome of chivalry and sociability. An observant Roman Catholic, he heard up to 5 masses a day, and let himself be influenced by his advisors, from whom he was never apart. He was thus susceptible to whoever had his ears. This contributed to a state of hostility between his young contemporaries and the Lord Chancellor, Cardinal Thomas Wolsey. As long as Wolsey had his ear, Henry's Roman Catholicism was secured. In 1521, he had defended the Roman Catholic Church from Martin Luther's accusations of heresy in a book he wrote entitled The Defense of the Seven Sacraments, for which he was awarded the title Defender of the Faith by Pope Leo X. Wolsey's enemies at court included those who had been influenced by Lutheran ideas, among whom the attractive charismatic Anne Boleyn. Anne arrived at court in 1522 as maid of honor to Queen Catherine, having spent some years in France being educated by Queen Claude of France. Anne was a distinguished French conversationalist, singer, and dancer. By 1527, Henry wanted his marriage to Catherine annulled. She had not produced a male heir who survived longer than 2 months, but Henry wanted a son to secure the Tudor dynasty. Before Henry's father ascended the throne, England had been beset by civil warfare over rival claims to the English crown. Henry wanted to avoid a similar uncertainty over the succession. Catherine of Aragon's only surviving child was Princess Mary. Henry claimed that the lack of a male heir was because his marriage was blighted in the eyes of God. Catherine had been his late brother's wife, and it was therefore against biblical teachings for Henry to have married her in the first place, and a special dispensation from Pope Julius II had been needed to allow the wedding in the first place. Henry argued that the marriage was never valid because the biblical prohibition was part of an unbreakable divine law, and even popes could not dispense with it. In 1527, Henry asked Pope Clement VII to annul the marriage, but the Pope refused. Clement also feared the wrath of Catherine's nephew, Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, whose troops earlier that year had sacked Rome and briefly taken the Pope prisoner. The combination of Henry's scruple of conscience and his captivation by Anne Boleyn made his desire to rid himself of his queen compelling. Wolsey's subsequent death in November 1530 on his way to London to answer a charge of high treason left Henry open to both the influences of the supporters of the Queen and the opposing influences of those who sanctioned the abandonment of the Roman allegiance, for whom an annulment was but an opportunity. In 1529, the king summoned Parliament to deal with the annulment and other grievances against the Church. The Roman Catholic Church was a powerful institution in England with a number of privileges. The king could not tax or sue clergy in civil courts. The Church could also grant fugitive sanctuary, and many areas of the law, such as the family law, were controlled by the Church. For centuries, kings had attempted to reduce the Church's power, and the English Reformation was a continuation of this power struggle. The Reformation Parliament sat from 1529 to 1536 and brought together those who wanted reform, but who disagreed about what form it should take. There were common lawyers who resented the privileges of the clergy to summon laity to their ecclesiastical courts, and there were those who had been influenced by Lutheranism and were hostile to the theology of Rome. Henry's chancellor, Thomas More, successor to Wolsey, also wanted reform. He wanted new laws against heresy. Lawyer and Member of Parliament Thomas Cromwell saw how Parliament could be used to advance royal supremacy over the Church and further Protestant beliefs. Initially, Parliament passed minor legislation to control ecclesiastical fees, clerical pluralism, and sanctuary. In the matter of the annulment, no progress seemed possible. The Pope seemed more afraid of Emperor Charles V than of Henry. Anne, Cromwell, and their allies wished simply to ignore the Pope, but in October 1530, a meeting of clergy and lawyers advised that Parliament could not empower the Archbishop of Canterbury to act against the Pope's prohibition. Henry thus resolved to bully the priests. By 1532, Cromwell was responsible for managing government business in the House of Commons. He authored and presented to the Commons the Supplication against the Ordinaries, which was a list of grievances against the Church, including abuses of power and the Convocation's independent legislative authority. After passing the Commons, the supplication was presented to the King as a petition for reform on the 18th of March. On the 26th of March, the Act in Conditional Restraint of Annates mandated the clergy pay no more than 5% of their first year's revenue to Rome. On the 10th of May, the king demanded of the Convocation that the Church renounce all authority to make laws. On the 15th of May, the Convocation renounced its authority to make canon law without royal assent, the so-called submission of the clergy. The next day, More resigned as Lord Chancellor, and this left Cromwell as Henry's chief minister. Archbishop Warham died in August 1532. Henry wanted Thomas Cranmer, a Protestant who could be relied on to oppose the papacy, to replace him. The Pope reluctantly approved Cranmer's appointment, and he was consecrated on the 30th of March 1533. By this time, Henry was secretly married to a pregnant Anne. The impending birth of an heir gave new urgency to annulling his marriage to Catherine. Nevertheless, a decision continued to be delayed because Rome was the final authority in all church matters. To address this issue, Parliament passed the Act in Restraint of Appeals, which outlawed appeals to Rome on ecclesiastical matters and declared England an independent country in every respect. Cranmer was now able to grant an annulment of the marriage to Catherine as Henry required, pronouncing on the 23rd of May the judgment that Henry's marriage with Catherine had been against the law of God. The Pope responded by excommunicating Henry on the 11th of July, 1533, and Anne gave birth to a daughter, Princess Elizabeth, on the 7th of September. In 1534, Parliament took further action to limit papal authority in England. A new Heresy Act ensured that no one could be punished for speaking against the Pope, and also made it more difficult to convict someone of heresy. However, Sacramentarians and Anabaptists continued to be vigorously persecuted. The Act of First Fruits and Tenths transferred the taxes on church income from the Pope to the Crown. The acts concerning Peter's pence and dispensations outlawed the annual payment by landowners of Peter's pence to the Pope, and transferred the power to grant dispensations and licenses from the Pope to the Archbishop of Canterbury. The first act of supremacy made Henry supreme head of the Church of England. In case this should be resisted, Parliament passed the Treasons Act 1534, which made it high treason punishable by death to deny royal supremacy. The following year, Thomas More and John Fisher were executed under this legislation. Finally, in 1536, Parliament passed the Act Against the Pope's Authority, which removed the last part of papal authority still legal. This was Rome's power in England to decide disputes concerning the Scripture. The break with Rome gave Henry VIII power to administer the English Church, tax it, appoint its officials, and control its laws. It also gave him control over the Church's doctrine and ritual. While Henry remained a Roman Catholic, his most important supporters in breaking with Rome were the Protestants. Yet not all of his supporters were Protestants. Some of them were Roman Catholics, like Stephen Gardiner, opposed to the new theology, but who felt that papal supremacy was not essential to the Church of England's identity. The king relied on Protestants such as Thomas Cromwell and Thomas Cranmer to carry out his religious program, and embrace the language of the Continental Reformation while maintaining a middle way between religious extremes. What followed was a period of doctrinal confusion as both conservatives and reformers attempted to shape the Church's future direction. The Protestants were aided by Cromwell, who in January 1535 was made vice-regent in spirituals. Effectively, the king's vicar general, Cromwell's authority was greater than that of the bishops. Largely due to Anne Boleyn's influence, a number of Protestants were appointed bishops between 1534 and 1536. During the same period, the most influential Roman Catholic bishop, Stephen Gardiner, was sent to France on a diplomatic commission and thus removed from an active role in English politics for 3 years. Cromwell's program, assisted by Anne Boleyn's influence over the bishop's appointments, was not merely against the clergy and the power of Rome. He persuaded Henry that safety from political alliances that Rome might attempt to bring together lay in negotiations with the German Lutheran princes of the Schmalkaldic League. There also seemed to be a possibility that Emperor Charles V might act to avenge his rejected aunt and to enforce the Pope's excommunication. The negotiations did not lead to an alliance, but did bring Lutheran ideas to England. In 1536, the Convocation adopted the first doctrinal statement for the Church of England, the 10 Articles. This was followed by the Bishop's Book in 1537. These established a semi-Lutheran doctrine for the Church. Justification by faith, qualified by an emphasis on good works following justification, was a core teaching. The traditional 7 sacraments were reduced to 3: baptism, Eucharist, and penance. Roman Catholic teaching on praying to saints, purgatory, and the use of images in worship was undermined. In August 1536, the same month that the 10 Articles were published, Cromwell issued a set of royal injunctions to the clergy. Minor feast days were changed into normal workdays, including those celebrating a church's patron saint, and most feasts during harvest time. The rationale was also economic, as too many holidays were leading to a loss of productivity. In addition, Protestants considered feast days to be examples of superstitions. Clergy were to discourage pilgrimages and instruct the people to give it to the poor rather than make offerings to images. The clergy were also ordered to place Bibles in both English and Latin in every church for the people to read. In July 1538, the statues of Our Lady of Walsingham, Our Lady of Ipswich, and other Marian images were burned at Chelsea on Cromwell's orders. In September, Cromwell issued a second set of royal injunctions ordering the destruction of images to which pilgrimage offerings were made, the prohibition of lighting votive candles before the image of saints, and the preaching of sermons against the veneration of images and relics. Afterwards, the shrine and bones of Thomas Becket, considered by many to have been martyred in defense of the Roman Catholic Church's liberties, were destroyed at Canterbury Cathedral. For Cromwell and Cranmer, a step in the Protestant agenda was attacking monasticism, which was associated with the doctrine of purgatory. One of the primary functions of monasteries was to pray for the souls of their benefactors and for the souls of all Christians. While the king was not opposed to religious houses on theological grounds, there was concern over the loyalty of the monastic orders, which were international in character and resistant to royal supremacy. The Franciscan observant houses were closed in August 1534, after that order refused to repudiate papal authority. Between 1535 and 1537, 18 Carthusians were killed for doing the same. The crown was also experiencing financial difficulties, and the wealth of the church, in contrast to its political weakness, made confiscation of church property both tempting and easy. Seizure of monastic wealth was not unprecedented. It had happened before in 1295, 1337, and 1369. The church owned between 1/5 and 1/3 of all the land in England. Cromwell realized that he could bind the gentry and the nobility to royal supremacy by selling to them the huge amount of church lands, and that any reversion to pre-royal supremacy would result in upsetting many of the powerful people in the country. In 1534, Cromwell initiated a visitation of the monasteries, ostensibly to examine their character, but in fact to value their assets with a view to expropriation. The visiting commissioners claimed to have uncovered sexual immorality and financial impropriety amongst the monks and nuns, which became the justification for their suppression. There were also reports of the possession and display of false relics. Leading reformers, led by Anne Boleyn, wanted to convert monasteries into places of study and good letters, and to the continual relief of the poor, but this was not done. In 1536, the Dissolution of the Lesser Monasteries Act closed smaller houses valued at less than £200 a year. Henry used the revenue to help build coastal defenses against expected invasion, and all the land was given to the crown or sold to the aristocracy. 34 houses were saved by paying for exemptions. Monks and nuns affected by closures were transferred to larger houses, and monks had the option of becoming secular clergy. The royal supremacy and the abolition of papal authority had not caused widespread unrest, but the attacks on monasteries and the abolition of saints' days and pilgrimages did provoke violence. Mobs attacked those sent to break up monastic buildings. Suppression commissioners were attacked by local people in several places. In northern England, there were a series of uprisings against the dissolutions in late 1536 and early 1537. The Lincolnshire Rising occurred in October 1536 and culminated in a force of 40,000 rebels assembling at Lincoln. They demanded an end to taxation during peacetime, the repeal of the Statute of Uses, an end to the suppression of monasteries, and that heresy be purged and heretics be punished. Henry refused to negotiate, and the revolt collapsed as the nervous gentry convinced the common people to disperse. However, the Pilgrimage of Grace was much more serious. The revolt began in October at Yorkshire and spread to the other northern counties. About 50,000 strong, the rebels under Robert Aske's leadership restored 16 of the 26 northern monasteries that had been dissolved. Due to the size of the rebellion, the king was persuaded to negotiate. In December, the Duke of Norfolk offered the rebels a pardon and a parliament to consider their grievances. Aske then sent the rebels home. The promises made to them, however, were ignored by the king, and Norfolk was instructed to put the rebellion down. 47 of the Lincolnshire rebels were executed, and 132 from the Pilgrimage of Grace. The failure of the Pilgrimage of Grace only sped up the process of dissolution, and may have convinced Henry VIII that all religious houses needed to be closed. In 1540, the last monasteries were dissolved, wiping out an important element of Roman Catholicism. Former monks were given modest pensions from the Court of Augmentations, and those that could still work sought it as parish priests. Former nuns received smaller pensions, and as they were still bound by vows of chastity, they were forbidden to marry. Henry personally devised a plan to form at least 13 new dioceses, so that most counties had one based on a former monastery, although this scheme was only partially carried out. In September 1538, Stephen Gardiner returned to England, and official religious policy began to drift in a more conservative direction. This was due in part to the eagerness of establishment Protestants to disassociate themselves from religious radicals. In September, 2 Lutheran princes, the Elector of Saxony and the Landgrave of Hesse, sent warnings of Anabaptist activity in England. A commission was swiftly created to seek out the Anabaptists. Henry personally presided at the trial of John Lambert in November 1538 for denying the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. At the same time, he shared in the drafting of a proclamation ordering Anabaptists and Sacramentarians to get out of the country or face death. Discussion of the real presence was forbidden, and priests who married were to be dismissed. It was becoming clear then that the king's view on religion differed from those of Cromwell and Cranmer. Henry made his Roman Catholic preferences known during the Easter Triduum of 1539, where he crept to the cross on Good Friday. Later that year, Parliament passed the 6 Articles, reaffirming Roman Catholic beliefs and practices such as transubstantiation, clerical celibacy, confession to a priest, votive masses, and withholding communion wine from the laity. On the 28th of June 1540, Cromwell, Henry's longtime advisor and loyal servant, was executed. Many other arrests under the act followed. On the 30th of July, the reformers Barnes, William Jerome, and Thomas Gerard were burned at the stake. In a display of religious impartiality, however, Thomas Abel, Richard Featherstone, and Edward Powell, all of whom were Roman Catholics, were hanged and quartered, while the Protestants burned. Despite setbacks, Protestants managed to win some victories. In May 1541, the king ordered copies of the Great Bible to be placed in all churches, and failure to comply would result in a £2 fine. Protestants could celebrate the growing access to vernacular scripture, as most churches had Bibles by 1545. The iconoclastic policies of 1538 were continued in the autumn, when the archbishops of Canterbury and York were ordered to destroy all remaining shrines in England. Roman Catholics nevertheless seemed to have the upper hand. By the spring of 1543, Protestant innovations had been reversed, and only the break with Rome and the dissolution of the monasteries remained unchanged. In May 1543, a new formulary was published to replace the bishop's book. This king's book rejected justification by faith alone and defended traditional ceremonies and the use of images. This was followed days later by passage of the Act for the Advancement of True Religion, which restricted Bible reading to men and women of noble birth. By the spring of 1544, the Roman Catholics appeared to be losing influence once again. In March, Parliament made it more difficult to prosecute people for violating the 6 Articles. Cranmer's Exhortation and Litany, the first official English service, was published in June 1544, and the King's Primer became the only authorized English prayer book in May 1545. Both texts had a Protestant emphasis. After the death of the Roman Catholic Edward Lee in September 1544, the Protestant Robert Holgate replaced him as Archbishop of York. In 1546, the Roman Catholics were once again in the ascendant. A series of controversial sermons preached by the Protestant Edward Crome set off a persecution of Protestants that the Roman Catholics used to effectively target their rivals. It was during this time that Anne Askew was tortured in the Tower of London and burnt at the stake. Even Henry's last wife, Catherine Parr, was suspected of heresy, but saved herself by appealing to the king's mercy. With the Protestants on the defensive, Roman Catholics pressed their advantage by banning Protestant books. The conservative persecution of Queen Catherine, however, backfired. By November 1546, there were already signs that religious policy was once again tilting towards Protestantism. The king's will provided for a regency council to rule after his death, which would have been dominated by Roman Catholics such as the Duke of Norfolk, Lord Chancellor Wriothesley, Bishop Gardiner, and Bishop Tunstall. After a dispute with the king, Bishop Gardiner, the leading Roman Catholic churchman, was disgraced and removed as a councillor. Later, the Duke of Norfolk, the most powerful Roman Catholic nobleman, was arrested. By the time Henry died in 1547, the Protestant Edward Seymour, brother of Jane Seymour, Henry's third wife, managed by a number of alliances such as with Lord Lisle to gain control over the Privy Council. Henry died in 1547. His 9-year-old son, Edward VI, inherited the throne. Because Edward was given a Protestant humanist education, Protestants held high expectations and hoped he would be like Josiah, the king of Judah who destroyed the altars and images of Baal. During the 7 years of Edward's reign, the Protestant establishment would gradually implement religious changes that were to destroy one church and build another. Initially, however, Edward was of little account politically. Real power was in the hands of the Regency Council, which elected Edward Seymour, 1st Duke of Somerset, to be Lord Protector. The Protestant Somerset pursued reform hesitantly at first, partly because his powers were still being challenged. The 6 Articles remained the law of the land, and a proclamation was issued on the 24th of May, reassuring the people against any innovations and changes in religion. Seymour and Cranmer did plan to further the reformation of religion. In July, a book of homilies was published, from which all clergy were to preach from on Sundays. The homilies were explicitly Protestant in their content, condemning relics, images, rosary beads, holy waters, palms, and other Roman Catholic superstitions. It also directly contradicted the King's Book by teaching, "We be justified by faith only, freely and without works." Despite objections from Gardiner, who questioned the legality of bypassing both Parliament and the Convocation, justification by faith had been made a central teaching of the Church of England. In August 1547, 30 commissioners, nearly all Protestants, were appointed to carry out a royal visitation of England's churches. The royal injunctions of 1547, issued to guide the commissioners, were borrowed from Cromwell's 1538 injunctions but revised to be more radical. Church processions, one of the most dramatic and public aspects of the traditional liturgy, were banned. The injunctions also attacked the use of sacramentals, such as holy water. It was emphasized that they imparted neither blessing nor healing, but were only reminders of Christ. Lighting votive candles before saints' images had been forbidden in 1538, and the 1547 injunctions went further by outlawing those placed on the rood loft. Reciting the rosary was also condemned. The injunctions set off a wave of iconoclasm in the autumn of 1547. While the injunctions only condemned images that were abused as objects of worship or devotion, the definition of abuse was brought in to justify the destruction of all images and relics. Stained glass, shrines, statues, and roods were defaced or destroyed. Church walls were whitewashed and covered with biblical texts condemning idolatry. When a new parliament met in November 1947, it began to dismantle the laws passed during Henry VIII's reign to protect Roman Catholicism. The Act of 6 Articles was repealed, decriminalizing denial of the real physical presence of Christ in the Eucharist. The old heresy laws were also repealed, allowing free debate on religious questions. In December, the Sacrament Act allowed the laity to receive communion under both kinds, the wine as well as the bread. This was opposed by Roman Catholics, but welcomed by Protestants. The second year of Edward's reign was a turning point for the English Reformation. Many people identified the year 1548, rather than the 1530s, as the beginning of the English Church's schism from the Roman Catholic Church. On the 18th of January, the Privy Council abolished the use of candles on Candlemas, ashes on Ash Wednesday, and palms on Palm Sunday. On the 21st of February, the Council explicitly ordered the removal of all church images. On the 8th of March, a royal proclamation announced a more significant change, the first major reform of the Mass and of the Church of England's official Eucharistic theology. The Order of the Communion was a series of English exhortations and prayers that reflected Protestant theology and were inserted into the Latin Mass. A significant departure from tradition was that individual confession to a priest, long a requirement before receiving the Eucharist, was made optional and replaced with a general confession said by the congregation as a whole. The effect on religious custom was profound, as a majority of lay people, not just Protestants, most likely ceased confessing their sins to their priests. By 1548, Cranmer and other leading Protestants had moved from the Lutheran to the Calvinist position on the Eucharist. Significant to Cranmer's change of mind was the influence of Strasbourg theologian Martin Bucer. The shift can be seen in the communion order's teaching on the Eucharist. Lay people were instructed that when receiving the sacrament, they spiritually eat the flesh of Christ, an attack on the belief in the real bodily presence of Christ in the Eucharist. The communion order was incorporated into the new prayer book, largely unchanged. That prayer book and liturgy, the Book of Common Prayer, was authorized by the Act of Uniformity 1549. It replaced the several regional Latin rites then in use with an English language liturgy. Authored by Cranmer, this first prayer book was a temporary compromise with Roman Catholics. It provided Protestants with a service free from what they considered superstition, while maintaining the traditional structure of the Mass. The cycles and seasons of the church year continued to be observed, and there were texts for daily matins, morning prayer, mass, and evensong, evening prayer. In addition, there was a calendar of saints' feasts with collects and scripture readings appropriate for the day. Priests still wore vestments, and many of the services were little changed. Baptism kept a strongly sacramental character, including the blessing of water in the baptismal font, promises made by godparents making the sign of the cross on the child's forehead and wrapping it in a white chrism cloth. The confirmation and marriage services followed the Sarum rite. There were also remnants of prayer for the dead and the Requiem Mass, such as the provision for celebrating a Holy Communion at a funeral. Nevertheless, the first Book of Common Prayer was a radical departure from the Roman Catholic worship, in that it eliminated almost everything that had until then been central to Eucharistic piety. Communion took place without any elevation of the consecrated bread and wine. The elevation had been the central moment of the old liturgy because it was attached to the idea of real presence. In addition, the prayer of consecration was changed to reflect Protestant theology. While the medieval canon of the Mass explicitly identified the priest's action at the altar with the sacrifice of Christ, the prayer book broke the connection by stating the Church's offering of thanksgiving in the Eucharist was not the same as Christ's sacrifice on the cross. Instead of the priest offering the sacrifice of Christ to God the Father, the assembled offered their praises and thanksgiving. The Eucharist was now to be understood as merely a means of partaking in and receiving the benefits of Christ's sacrifice. There were other departures from tradition. At least initially, there was no music because it would take time to replace the Church's body of Latin music. Most of the liturgical year was simply bulldozed away, and the only major feasts of Christmas, Easter, and Whitsun, along with a few biblical saints' days, and only 2 Marian feast days, the Purification and the Annunciation. The Assumption, Corpus Christi, and other festivals were removed. In 1549, Parliament also legalized clerical marriage, something already practiced by some Protestants, including Cranmer, but considered an abomination by Roman Catholics. Enforcement of the new liturgy did not always take place without a struggle. In the West Country, the introduction of the Book of Common Prayer was the catalyst for a series of uprisings through the summer of 1549. There were similar upheavals elsewhere, from the West Midlands to Yorkshire. The Prayer Book Rebellion was not only in reaction to the Prayer Book. The rebels demanded a full restoration of Roman Catholicism. In East Anglia, however, the rebellions lacked a Roman Catholic character. Kett's Rebellion in Norwich blended Protestant piety with demands for economic reforms and social justice. The insurrections were put down only after considerable loss of life. Somerset was blamed and was removed from power in October. It was wrongly believed by both the Roman Catholics and Protestants that the Reformation would be overturned. Succeeding Somerset as de facto regent was John Dudley, 1st Earl of Warwick, newly appointed Lord President of the Privy Council. Warwick saw further implementation of the reforming policy as a means of gaining Protestant support and defeating his Roman Catholic rivals. From that point on, the Reformation proceeded apace. Since the 1530s, one of the obstacles to Protestant reform had been the bishops, bitterly divided between a Roman Catholic majority and a Protestant minority. This obstacle was removed in 1550 and 1551 when the episcopate was purged of Roman Catholics. The newly enlarged and emboldened Protestant episcopate turns its attention to ending efforts by Roman Catholic clergy to counterfeit the Popish Mass through loopholes in the 1549 Prayer Book. The Book of Common Prayer was composed during a time when it was necessary to grant compromises and concessions to Roman Catholics. This was taken advantage of by Roman Catholic priests who made the new liturgy as much like the old one as possible, including elevating the Eucharist. To attack the Mass, Protestants began demanding the removal of stone altars. Bishop Ridley launched a campaign in May 1550 when he commanded that all altars would be replaced with wooden communion tables in his London diocese. Other bishops throughout the country followed his example, but there was also resistance. In November 1550, the Privy Council ordered the removal of all altars in an effort to end all of the disputes. While the prayer book used the term altar, Protestants preferred a table because at the Last Supper, Christ instituted the sacrament at a table. The removal of altars was also an attempt to destroy the idea that the Eucharist was Christ's sacrifice. In March 1550, a new ordinal was published that was based on Martin Bucer's own treatise on the form of ordination. While Bucer had provided for only one service for all 3 orders of clergy, the English ordinal was more conservative and had separate services for deacons, priests, and bishops. The 1549 Book of Common Prayer was criticized by Protestants both in England and abroad for being too susceptible to Roman Catholic reinterpretation. Shifts in Eucharistic theology between 1548 and 1552 also made the prayer book unsatisfactory. During that time, English Protestants achieved a consensus, rejecting any real bodily presence of Christ in the Eucharist. Some influential Protestants, such as Vermigli, defended Zwingli's symbolic view of the Eucharist. Less radical Protestants such as Bucer and Cranmer advocated for a spiritual presence in the sacrament. Cranmer himself had already adopted receptionist views on the Lord's Supper. In April 1552, a new Act of Uniformity authorized a revised Book of Common Prayer to be used in worship by the 1st of November. This new prayer book removed many of the Roman Catholic elements in the 1549 prayer book, resulting in a more Protestant liturgy. The communion service was designed to remove any hint of consecration or change in the bread and wine. Instead of unleavened wafers, ordinary bread was to be used. The prayer of invocation was removed, and the minister no longer said the body of Christ when delivering communion. Rather, he said, "Take and eat this in remembrance that Christ died for thee, and feed on him in thy heart by faith, with thanksgiving." Christ's presence in the Lord's Supper was a spiritual presence. In the new prayer book, the last vestiges of prayers for the dead were removed from the funeral service. Unlike the 1549 version, the 1552 prayer book removed many traditional sacramentals and observances that reflected belief in the blessing and exorcism of people and objects. In the baptism service, infants no longer received minor exorcism and the white chrism robe. Anointing was no longer included in the services for baptism, ordination, and visitation of the sick. These ceremonies were altered to emphasize the importance of faith rather than trusting in rituals or objects. Clerical vestments were simplified, and ministers were only allowed to wear the surplice and bishops had to wear a rochet. The confiscations caused tensions between Protestant church leaders and Warwick, who was now Duke of Northumberland. Cranmer, Ridley, and other Protestant leaders did not fully trust Northumberland. Northumberland, in turn, sought to undermine these bishops by promoting their critics, such as Jan Lasky and John Knox. Cranmer's plan for a revision of the English canon law, the Reformatio Iegum Ecclesiasticarum, failed in Parliament due to Northumberland's opposition. Despite such tensions, a new doctrinal statement to replace the King's Book was issued on royal authority in May 1553. The 42 articles reflected the Reformed theology and practice taking shape during Edward's reign. It affirmed predestination and that the king was the supreme head of the Church of England under Christ. King Edward became seriously ill in February and died in July 1553. Before his death, Edward was concerned that Mary, his devoutly Roman Catholic sister, would overturn his religious reforms. A new plan of succession was created in which both of Edward's sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, were bypassed on account of illegitimacy in favor of the Protestant Jane Grey, and the granddaughter of Edward's aunt Mary Tudor and daughter-in-law of the Duke of Northumberland. This new succession violated the Third Succession Act of 1544 and was widely seen as an attempt by Northumberland to stay in power. Northumberland was unpopular due to the church confiscations, and support for Jane collapsed. On the 19th of July, the Privy Council proclaimed Mary the Queen to the acclamation of the crowds in London. Now, both Protestants and Roman Catholics understood that the accession of Mary I to the throne meant a restoration of Roman Catholicism. Before any official sanction, Latin Masses began reappearing throughout England, despite the 1552 Book of Common Prayer remaining the only legal liturgy. Mary began her reign cautiously by emphasizing the need for tolerance in matters of religion and proclaiming that, for the time being, she would not compel religious conformity. This was in part Mary's attempt to avoid provoking Protestant opposition before she could consolidate her power. While Protestants were not a majority, their numbers had grown throughout Edward's reign. Following Mary's accession, the Duke of Norfolk, along with the Roman Catholic bishops Bonner, Gardiner, Tunstall, Day, and Heath, were released from prison and returned to their former diocese. By September 1553, Hooper and Cranmer were imprisoned. Northumberland himself was executed, but not before his conversion to Roman Catholicism. The break with Rome and the religious reforms of Henry VIII and Edward VI were achieved through parliamentary legislation and therefore could only be reversed through Parliament. When Parliament met in October, Bishop Gardiner, now Lord Chancellor, initially proposed the repeal of all religious legislation since 1529. The House of Commons refused to pass this bill, and after heated debate, Parliament repealed all of Edward's religious laws, including clerical marriage and the prayer book, in the first statute of repeal. By the 20th of December, the Mass was reinstated by law. There were disappointments for Mary. Parliament refused to penalize non-attendance at Mass and would not restore confiscated church property, and left open the question of papal supremacy. If Mary was to secure England for Roman Catholicism, she needed an heir, and her Protestant half-sister Elizabeth had to be prevented from inheriting the crown. On the advice of her cousin Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, she married his son Philip II of Spain in 1554. There was opposition and even a rebellion in Kent, even though it was provided that Philip would never inherit the kingdom if there was no heir, receive no estates, and had no coronation. By the end of 1554, Henry VIII's religious settlement had been reinstituted, but England was still not reunited with Rome. Before reunion could occur, church property disputes had to be settled, which in practice meant letting the nobility and the gentry who had bought confiscated church lands keep them. Cardinal Reginald Pole, the Queen's cousin, arrived in November 1554 as papal legate to end England's schism with the Roman Catholic Church. On the 20th of November, Pole addressed Parliament to ask it to end the schism. In response, Parliament submitted a petition to the Queen the next day, asking that this realm and dominions might again be united to the Church of Rome by the means of the Lord Cardinal Pole. On the 30th of November, Pole spoke to both houses of Parliament, absolving the members of Parliament with the whole realm and dominions thereof from all heresy and schism. Afterwards, bishops absolved diocesan clergy, and they in turn absolved parishioners. On the 26th of December, the Privy Council introduced legislation repealing the religious legislation of Henry VIII's reign and implementing the reunion with Rome. This bill was passed as the Second Statute of Repeal. Cardinal Pole would eventually replace Cranmer as Archbishop of Canterbury in 1556, jurisdictional issues between England and Rome having prevented Cranmer's removal. Mary could have had Cranmer tried and executed for treason. After all, he had supported the claims of Lady Jane Grey, but she resolved to have him tried for heresy. His recantations of his Protestantism would have been a major coup. Unhappily for her, he unexpectedly withdrew his recantations at the last minute, as he was to be burned at the stake, thus ruining her government's propaganda victory. As papal legate, Pole possessed authority over both his province of Canterbury and the province of York, which allowed him to oversee the Counter-Reformation throughout all of England. He reinstalled images, vestments, and plates in church. Around 2,000 married clergy were separated from their wives, but the majority of these were allowed to continue their work as priests. Pole was aided by some of the leading Catholic intellectuals, such as Spanish members of the Dominican order. In 1556, Pole ordered clergy to read one chapter of Bishop Bonner's A Profitable and Necessary Doctrine to their parishioners every Sunday. Modeled on the King's Book of 1543, Bonner's work was a survey of basic Roman Catholic teachings organized around the Apostles' Creed, 10 Commandments, 7 deadly sins, sacraments, the Lord's Prayer, and the Hail Mary. Bonner also produced a child's catechism and a collection of homilies. From December 1555 to February 1556, Cardinal Pole presided over a national legatine synod that provided a set of decrees entitled Reformatio Angliae, or the Reformation of England. The actions taken by the synod anticipated many of the reforms enacted throughout the Roman Catholic Church after the Council of Trent. Pole believed that ignorance and lack of discipline among the clergy had led to England's religious turmoil, and the synod's reform were designed to remedy both problems. Clerical absenteeism, pluralism, and simony were condemned. Preaching was placed at the center of the pastoral office, and all clergy were to provide sermons to the people. The most important part of the plan was the order to establish a seminary in each diocese, which would replace the disorderly manner in which priests had been trained before. The Council of Trent would later impose the seminary system upon the rest of the Roman Catholic Church. It was also the first to introduce the altar tabernacle, used to reserve Eucharistic bread for devotion and adoration. Mary did what she could to restore church finances and land taken in the reigns of her father and brother. In 1555, she returned to the church the first fruits and tenths revenue. But with these new funds came the responsibility of paying the pensions of ex-religious. She restored 6 religious houses with her own money, notably Westminster Abbey for the Benedictines and Sion Abbey for the Virginians. However, there were limits to what could be restored. Only 7 religious houses were refounded between 1555 and 1558, although there were plans to reestablish more. Of the 1,500 ex-religious still living, only about 100 resumed monastic life, and only a small number of chantries were refounded. Re-establishments were hindered by the changing nature of charitable giving. A plan to re-establish Grey Friars in London was prevented because its buildings were being occupied by Christ's Hospital, a school for orphan children. Now, Protestants who refused to conform remained an obstacle to Roman Catholic plans. Around 800 Protestants fled England to find safety in Protestant areas of Germany and Switzerland, establishing networks of independent congregations. Safe from persecution, these Marian exiles carried on a propaganda campaign against Roman Catholicism and the Queen's Spanish marriage, sometimes calling for rebellion. Those who remained in England were forced to practice their faith in secret and meet in underground congregations. In 1555, the initial reconciling tone of the regime began to harden with a revival of the medieval heresy laws, which authorized capital punishment as a penalty for heresy. The persecution of heretics was uncoordinated. Protestants brought attention to themselves usually due to some act of dissent, such as denouncing the Mass or refusing to receive the sacrament. Individuals accused of heresy were examined by a church official, and if heresy was found, given the choice between death and signing a recantation. In some cases, Protestants were burned at the stake after renouncing their recantation. Around 284 Protestants were martyred at the stake for heresy. Several leading reformers were executed, including Thomas Cranmer, Hugh Latimer, Nicholas Ridley, John Rogers, John Hooper, Robert Farrer, Rowland Taylor, and John Bradford. Lesser-known figures were also among the victims, including around 51 women. The Marian persecution was unprecedented in the English experience and failed to intimidate all Protestants, whose bravery at the stake inspired others. After her death, the Queen became known as Bloody Mary, due to the influence of John Foxe, one of the Marian exiles. Published in 1563, Foxe's Book of Martyrs provided accounts of the executions. In 1571, the Convocation at Canterbury ordered that Foxe's book should be placed in every cathedral in the land. Mary's efforts at restoring Roman Catholicism were also frustrated by the Church itself. Pope Paul IV declared war on Philip and recalled Paul to Rome to have him tried as a heretic. Mary refused to let him go. The support she might have expected from a grateful pope was thus denied. From 1557, the pope refused to confirm English bishops, leading to vacancies and hurting the Marian religious program. Despite these obstacles, the 5-year restoration was successful. There was support for Roman Catholicism among the people, and Protestants remained a minority. Consequently, Protestants secretly ministering to underground congregations, such as Thomas Bentham, were planning for a long haul, a ministry of survival. Mary's death in November 1558, childless and without having made provision from a Roman Catholic to succeed her, meant that her Protestant sister Elizabeth would be the next queen. Elizabeth I inherited a kingdom in which a majority of people, especially the political elite, were Roman Catholics, and England's main ally was Catholic Spain. For these reasons, the proclamation announcing her accession forbade any breach, alteration, or change of any order or usage presently established within this our realm. However, this was only temporary. The new queen was Protestant, though a conservative one. She also filled her new government with Protestants. The Queen's principal secretary was Sir William Cecil, a moderate Protestant. The Privy Council was filled with former Edwardian politicians, and only Protestants preached at court. In 1558, Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy, which re-established the Church of England's independence from Rome and conferred on Elizabeth the title of Supreme Governor of the Church of England. The Act of Uniformity of 1559 authorized the 1559 Book of Common Prayer, which is a revived version of the 1552 Prayer Book from Edward's reign. The modifications were made to appeal to Roman Catholics and Lutherans, including giving individuals greater latitude concerning belief in the real presence and authorizing the use of traditional priestly vestments. In 1571, the 39 Articles were adopted as a confessional statement for the Church, and a book of homilies was issued outlining the Church's Reformed theology in greater detail. The Elizabethan Settlement established a church that was Protestant in doctrine, but that preserved certain characteristics of medieval Roman Catholicism, such as cathedrals, church choirs, a formal liturgy contained in the prayer book, traditional vestments, and episcopal polity. Conflicts over the Elizabethan Settlement stem from this tension between Roman Catholic structure and Protestant theology, so during the reigns of Elizabeth and James I, several factions developed within the Church of England. Church papists were Roman Catholics who outwardly conformed to the established church while maintaining their Roman Catholic faith in secret. Roman Catholic authorities disapproved of such outward conformity. Recusants were Roman Catholics who refused to attend Church of England services as required by law. This was punishable by fines of £20 a month. By 1574, Roman Catholic recusants had organized an underground Roman Catholic church, distinct from the Church of England. However, it had two major weaknesses: membership lost as church papists conformed fully to the Church of England, and a shortage of priests. Between 1574 and 1603, 600 Roman Catholic priests were sent to England. The influx of foreign-trained Roman Catholic priests, the unsuccessful revolt of the Northern Earls, the excommunication of Elizabeth, and the discovery of the Ridolfi plot all contributed to a perception that Roman Catholicism was treasonous. Execution of Roman Catholic priests became more common. In 1585, it became treason for a Roman Catholic priest to enter the country, as well as for anyone to aid or shelter him. As the older generation of recusant priests died out, Roman Catholicism collapsed among the lower classes in the north, west, and in Wales. Without priests, these social classes drifted into the Church of England, and Roman Catholicism was forgotten. By Elizabeth's death in 1603, Roman Catholicism had become the faith of a small sect, largely confined to gentry households. Gradually, England was transformed into a Protestant country as the prayer book shaped Elizabethan religious life. By the 1580s, conformist Protestants were becoming a majority. Calvinism appealed to many conformists, and Calvinist clergy held the best bishoprics and deaneries during Elizabeth's reign. Other Calvinists were unsatisfied with elements of the Elizabethan Settlement and wanted further reforms to make the Church of England more like the continental Reformed churches. These nonconformist Calvinists became known as Puritans. Some Puritans refused to bow at the name of Jesus, to make the sign of the cross in baptism, use wedding rings, or organ music in church. They especially resented the requirement that clergy wear the white surplice and clerical cap. Puritan clergymen preferred to wear black academic attire. Many Puritans believed the Church of England should follow the example of Reformed churches in other parts of Europe and adopt Presbyterian polity, under which government by bishops would be replaced with government by elders. However, all attempts to enact further reforms through Parliament were blocked by the Queen. Traditionally, historians have dated the end of the English Reformation to Elizabeth's religious settlement. There are scholars who advocate for a long Reformation that continued into the 17th and 18th centuries. During the early Stuart period, the Church of England's dominant theology was still Calvinism, but a group of theologians associated with Bishop Lancelot Andrewes disagreed with many aspects of the Reformed tradition, especially its teaching on predestination. They looked to the Church Fathers rather than the Reformers and preferred using the more traditional 1549 prayer book. Due to their belief in free will, this new faction is known as the Arminian Party, but their high church orientation was more controversial. James I tried to balance the Puritan forces within his church with followers of Andrewes, promoting many of them at the end of his reign. During the reign of Charles I, the Arminians were ascendant and closely associated with William Laud, the Archbishop of Canterbury from 1633 to 1645. Laud and his followers believed the Reformation had gone too far and launched a beauty of holiness counter-revolution, wishing to restore what they saw as a lost majesty in worship and lost dignity for the sacerdotal priesthood. Laudianism, however, was unpopular with both Puritans and Anglican conformists, who viewed the high church innovations as undermining forms of worship which they had grown used to. The English Civil War resulted in the overthrow of Charles I, and a Puritan-dominated parliament began to dismantle the Elizabethan settlement. The Puritans, however, were divided among themselves and failed to agree on an alternative religious settlement. A variety of new religious movements appeared,